Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. This year, Democracy Now! Is celebrating our 25th anniversary. That's a quarter of a century of bringing you the voices and stories you won't hear anywhere else. Democracy Now! Has always refused to take government or corporate funding because nothing is more important to us than our editorial independence. But that means we rely on you, our audience, for support. Please visit democracynow.org right now to make your contribution and help us stay on the air for at least another 25 years. Thank you so much. Oh, and remember, wearing a mask is an act of love. Wearing two is even better. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Through these 11 days of madness, we got news every single day nearly of new children killed, 12 now in total, who were in our psychosocial program. They were then killed with their families, with their dreams and their nightmares that we were treating them for.
As the United Nations Human Rights Chief warns Israel may have committed war crimes in Gaza, we'll look at how Israel killed 12 Palestinian children being treated for trauma from past Israeli bombings. We'll talk to Jan Egeland, head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, about the crisis in Gaza. He'll join us from Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where tens of thousands have fled their homes fearing another volcano eruption. Then we look back 100 years ago to the Tulsa race massacre, one of the deadliest acts of racist terror in U.S. history, when a white mob in Oklahoma attacked what was known as Black Wall Street, killing an estimated 300 black residents.
The destruction was so complete. The suffering was so biblical. The betrayal was so profound.
Black communities deserve the opportunity to confront the past.
Our city has been stuck since then. We've never recovered.
Tulsa was the best place in the nation for African Americans.
We have everything from hotels, theaters,
doctors, lawyers.
People refer to it as Black Wall Street.
We'll speak to Stanley Nelson about his new documentary, Tulsa Burning, the 1921 Race Massacre. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights says Israel may have committed war crimes during its 11-day bombardment of the Gaza Strip earlier this month. Michelle Bachelet said Thursday she'd seen no evidence to back Israeli claims civilian buildings in Gaza bombed by Israel were being used for military purposes.
Airstrikes in such densely populated areas resulted in a high level of civilian fatalities and injuries, as well as the widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure. Such strikes raise serious concerns of Israel's compliance with the principles of distinction and proportionality under international humanitarian law.
High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet also said Hamas violated international law by firing rockets into Israel. Her comments came as the UN Human Rights Council voted to create a permanent commission of inquiry to monitor human rights abuses in Israel, Gaza, and the occupied West Bank. Michael Link, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories, testified to the Council Thursday.
What we have witnessed in Gaza in these past few weeks haunts the conscience of the world. Approximately 242 Palestinians killed, the majority of whom are civilians, and at least 63 of whom are children. Almost 2,000 who are injured. There's been massive property destruction.
After headlines, we'll speak with Jan Egeland, head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, about the crisis in Gaza. The World Health Organization warned Thursday African nations need to acquire another 20 million doses of AstraZeneca's COVID vaccine in the next 6 weeks, or millions of people will miss out on their second dose. The head of the WHO's African operations said, quote, "Any pause in our vaccination campaigns will lead to lost lives and lost hope." So far, African countries have received just 43 million vaccine doses for the continent's 1.2 billion people. This comes as a new report by Public Citizen finds wealthy nations could produce enough vaccines to inoculate 80% of people in low and middle-income countries within a year, with an investment of just $25 billion. The People's Vaccine Alliance tweeted in response, quote, "The global vaccine apartheid is a policy choice. We have the means to end it," they said. Senate Republicans are preparing to use the filibuster to block Democrats from voting to create a 9/11-style commission to study the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Debate over a key procedural vote on the commission stretched until about 3 a.m. this morning without resolution. Meanwhile, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is reportedly calling fellow Republicans, asking them to support a filibuster of the bill as a personal favor. Alaska Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski accused McConnell of blocking the commission for political gain. Murkowski and just two other Republican senators, Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, support the commission's creation. On Thursday, the mother and girlfriend of Brian Sicknick, the police officer who died a day after he was attacked by the pro-Trump mob at the Capitol, personally met with Republican senators to press them to support the commission. The Senate confirmed Christine Wormuth as the first woman Secretary of the Army. She served as a Pentagon policy chief under President Obama and led President Biden's transition team at the Pentagon. Meanwhile, Biden's expected to announce his nomination of former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel to be the next ambassador to Japan. Emanuel, who also served as a chief of staff for Obama, has faced fierce public backlash for helping cover up the 2014 police killing of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. In media news, Amazon announced Wednesday it's acquiring MGM Studios for $8.45 billion, its second-largest acquisition after Whole Foods. With the purchase, Amazon will add the James Bond franchise and thousands of older films to its Prime Video streaming catalog. In a statement, Public Citizen said, quote, "Amazon is prioritizing monopolizing content for the streaming service while completely failing to address the real concerns of workers, small businesses, and regulators. This massive, dominant monopoly needs to be broken up," Public Citizen said. The planned merger comes on the heels of a $130 billion merger between Warner Media and Discovery. Warner Media was spun off of Time Warner, which AT&T acquired in 2018 for $85 billion. Top executives of the largest U.S. banks appeared on Capitol Hill for a second straight day Thursday, where some lawmakers accused them of pandemic profiteering. On Wednesday, Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren grilled the CEOs of Bank of America, Citibank, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo for charging customers a collective $4 billion in overdraft fees during the COVID crisis.
While you automatically and at no cost got complete protection from overdraft fees at the Federal Reserve, could you please raise your hand if you gave the same automatic protection to your customers and automatically waived all of their overdraft fees? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone raise a hand, and that's because none of you gave the same help to your customers that the bank regulators extended to you.
More information has emerged about the gunman in the San Jose mass shooting who killed 9 co-workers before turning the gun on himself. A Homeland Security memo reveals customs officers had detained Samuel Cassidy in 2016 as he returned from a trip to the Philippines. He professed a hatred for his workplace, where Wednesday's massacre took place, and possessed books and manifestos about terrorism. An ex-partner accused him of sexual assault in 2009, and his ex-wife told reporters he talked about killing co-workers when they were married well over a decade ago. Authorities recovered 3 handguns at the scene of the massacre, at least 2 of which were semi-automatic pistols with 11-round magazines. The FBI said the guns were legally obtained and registered. And there's evidence that he targeted the victims he killed. In Washington state, prosecutors have charged 3 Tacoma police officers with murder over the March 2020 killing of Manuel Ellis, a 33-year-old black father of 2. Ellis was violently arrested and beaten by the officers on the side of the road and died while he was being restrained and in handcuffs. He can be heard saying, "I can't breathe," on a police scanner. Officers Christopher Burbank and Matthew Collins, who are white, are charged with second-degree murder. Asian-American officer Timothy Rankine faces a first-degree manslaughter charge. It's the first time in history the Washington State Attorney General's office has criminally charged a police officer over a deadly use-of-force incident. It comes more than a year after a county medical examiner ruled Ellis's death a homicide, reporting he died of hypoxia due to physical restraint. Authorities in the Democratic Republic of Congo have ordered as many as 1 million people to evacuate the city of Goma, as one of the world's most dangerous volcanoes is threatening to erupt for a second time in a week. Lava from Saturday's eruption left about 20,000 people homeless and killed at least 32 people, but powerful aftershocks and frequent tremors since then have rattled nerves and prompted fears over the fate of Goma, a densely populated city at the foot of the volcano. We'll go to Jan Egeland in Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's head of the Norwegian Refugee Council after headlines. And in Australia, a court ruled the government has a duty to protect children and the environment from the effects of the climate catastrophe. In a case brought by 8 high school students, a federal judge acknowledged, quote, many thousands will suffer premature death from heat stress or bushfire smoke. The judge stopped short, however, of granting an injunction on the expansion of a coal mine. This is Ava Princey, one of the young climate activists and plaintiffs in this historic case.
The law now recognises that the Environment Minister is in a special position of power to prevent foreseeable harms to young people. I feel elated by this decision, and this is not over. This case was about young people stepping up and demanding more from the adults whose actions are determining our future well-being.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, says Israel may have committed war crimes during its 11-day bombardment of Gaza, which killed at least 253 Palestinians, including 66 children. Bachelet spoke before the United Nations Human Rights Council.
Such strikes raise serious concerns of Israel's compliance with the principles of distinction and proportionality under international humanitarian law. Is found to be indiscriminate and disproportionate in their impact on civilians and civilian objects. Such attacks may constitute war crimes.
The UN Human Rights Council approved a resolution Thursday to launch a sweeping international investigation into war crimes committed in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. The resolution was drafted by the Organization of Islamic States.
Regrettably, the self-professed global champions of human rights continue to shield the occupier from global accountability and literally provide arms and ammunition for its widely reported war crimes and crimes of apartheid against the Palestinian people. Let us be clear, there is no legal and moral equivalence between the occupier and the occupied.
The Biden administration has vowed to help rebuild Gaza, but at the same time, it's moving ahead with a plan to sell $735 million worth of bombs to Israel, despite congressional opposition. Earlier this week, I spoke to Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, which works in Gaza. Last week, the council revealed 11 of the children killed in the Israeli bombing of Gaza were taking part in a program to help them deal with trauma from previous Israeli attacks. Egeland is the former humanitarian relief coordinator at the United Nations. He spoke to us from Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where tens of thousands have evacuated fearing another volcano eruption. We also talked about the crisis in the DRC, but I began by asking him to talk about the situation in Gaza.
Well, Gaza has become the home of hopelessness, where people are crammed together, 2 million people in a tiny place. It's smaller than the municipality of Oslo, where I normally live. There is no way people can leave the place. Israel and Egypt control the borders, and they don't let anybody out, really. They let only a bit of humanitarian aid in. During this onslaught, we didn't only have the 11 ones you told about, Amy. There was a 12th little girl killed. All of those we were trying to treat for trauma from the previous conflicts. There's been 5 wars since 2006. So a child would have grown up with nothing but violence, nothing but hopelessness. That's why we need Blinken and Biden and the leadership of the U.S. now to lead to a solution to this senseless repeat of conflicts where Palestinian children die.
So you have the United States providing the weapons for Israel to bomb Gaza and now committing to the rebuilding of Gaza. Can you talk about the problem with this?
Well, it seems futile, really. There seems to be a logical third path, namely for the U.S. to lead the international community, the U.S., Europe, and the Arab countries, to have some kind of an arbitration when you have an Israeli leadership and Palestinian leaderships incapable of solving the underlying conflicts that lead to repeat violence and insecurity for both peoples. So could the U.S. lead us, please, in reaching political solutions, an end to the occupation? And so we just had an earthquake here in Goma. That's why it's shaking. We need in Gaza to have an end to this serving hopelessness to children who will grow up with more and more bitterness and chaos. And I'm telling you, we humanitarian workers are sick and tired of building and rebuilding and see it all torn down again.
You co-signed a letter with 11 other heads of international humanitarian organizations to Secretary of State Blinken about the situation in Gaza. Talk about the issues you've raised. I mean, you had this constant bombardment where the president of the United States, President Biden, would not demand of Netanyahu a ceasefire. Said he might like one, he would urge one, but not make that diplomatic demand, particularly important since Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the world.
Yeah, we the 12 non-governmental organizations serving Palestinians on the ground, the civilian population, especially children, women, and the most vulnerable, we urged in our letter the United States to take the lead in ending the occupation, getting humanitarian access to all, consistently to all in need, ending the underlying injustice that means that we have this confrontation. But we're also trying to tell that we need help to be able to be active for all Palestinians, irrespective of where they are in Gaza. Too often the borders close in our face, and we cannot then even help the people in need.
Secretary General, last week you tweeted, quote, "We're devastated to learn that 11 of the children we helped in Gaza with trauma from previous violence are now killed by Israeli missiles. Israel must stop this madness. Children must be protected. Their homes and schools must not be targets." We also spoke with the head of UNRWA, the UN agency in Gaza, about the devastation and the number of schools and hospitals that were attacked. Tell us more about these children and what it means that you're funding trauma help for them.
Well, we've been to Gaza for a very long time. I'm personally also visited it regularly over the last 30 years. So during all of my visits to Gaza, where we have 50 humanitarian workers now working around the clock, as they have been for a very long time, the strongest impression is this hopelessness, this bitterness, this sense that the youth do not believe it will become better. It will become worse. So it's bitterness. They're giving up. We also then saw that too many children were having learning problems in school. I mean, they are having so much nightmares at night that they cannot really follow education. So we started a better learning program, as we call it, which is an excellent psychosocial program. And these children then started to learn better. They were making progress in school. And the Palestinians are, like their neighbors, the Israelis, very diligent, very talented, very organized. So we were a bit optimistic before this last repeat violence. And through these 11 days of madness, we got news every single day nearly of new children killed, 12 now in total, who were in our psychosocial program. They were then killed with their families, with their dreams and their nightmares that we were treating them for. I think that's a very strong symbol also of it cannot continue like this. The United States has to get the parties out of this repeat cycle of violence. Would we want to come back every 3, 4, 5 years for eternity with more bombing of urban areas? We've seen that our estimate is that 13,500 homes have been either damaged or even destroyed. We are accumulating rubble, we're accumulating dead children, and we're accumulating hopelessness if it continues like this.
Can you talk about what Israel and a lot of the mainstream media, at least in the United States, you're based in Norway, the equivalency of the Hamas missiles and the Israeli bombardment that killed over 250 Palestinians, a quarter of them, something like 66 children dead?
Well, this is disproportionate warfare. There is one occupier and that is strong, and there are people then having also now extremist organizations among themselves, trying to inflict as much damage on the other side as they can. But of course, there were more than 5 times the number of dead Palestinian children at total fatalities, military and civilian, of all ages on the Israeli side. So again, the U.S. military might that is given to Israel makes it be so much stronger than the other, and therefore we feel they should now reach out and try to make peace with their neighbors. It's not going to be easy because there's a lot of extremism now, and there will be more extremism because there is more bitterness and more hatred each time you have these kind of military campaigns.
Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, speaking to us about Gaza earlier this week from Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where tens of thousands have fled their homes fearing another volcanic eruption. We also talk about the crisis in Yemen and vaccine apartheid when we come back with him. to the Mississippi by Afro Fiesta. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Tens of thousands of people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo have fled their homes in the city of Goma after authorities warned Mount Nyiragongo might erupt again. Authorities have ordered as many as 1 million people to evacuate. At least 32 people died when the volcano began erupting on May 22nd. The volcano is one of the many crises confronting the DRC, where more than 5 million people are internally displaced after years of wars. We return now to my conversation with Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, a former high official at the United Nations. We were scheduled to interview him on our live program Tuesday from Goma, but he had to cancel at the last minute after an earthquake forced him to evacuate his office. Later that morning, we spoke to him from an outside location while the earth continued to shake. I asked him to talk about the situation in Goma.
Yes, I am indeed in Goma. There is an earthquake here every 5 minutes, 10 minutes. There was one while we just talked. So there is enormous seismic activity. People are scared. Many are leaving town for the second time. This building of my organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, we have to evacuate because it's in a red zone. The lava, which may flow again from the volcano, which is just up here to my right, may come back. It is really a mess in a situation that I come to because I would like to give some publicity to the enormous crisis that is overlooked in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are 20 million people here who need humanitarian relief. It's the largest neglected emergency on earth. So I'm glad we can talk about it, and not only because of the volcano that do get some attention. We need to talk about the war, the misery, the hunger, and the whole looting of DRC from strong capital from all over the world that want to have the minerals that is in the ground under here.
UNICEF is reporting over 100 children are missing in the area after having been separated from their parents following the eruption. Can you talk about how the country is dealing right now and what the Norwegian Refugee Council is doing?
We are going to the humanitarian organizations will care for those who fled from the volcano, and unless it really has an eruption that will become truly catastrophic. Now there is 1.5 million people here in Goma. We need to be able to do more for the millions who have been displaced by the conflicts. There are 150 armed groups active in the Congo. It is really horrific what is happening here.
And going to that larger issue of refugees, in 2020 alone, natural disasters and conflict uprooted, as you said, more than 40 million people. You deal with countries, and then there's the overall crisis of wars, climate change, and then you have the pandemic. Can you talk about how the pandemic has affected the refugee situation in the world?
Well, the pandemic really has been a tremendous medical shock and social shock for the whole world. The United States has suffered, so have we in Europe. But it's hard for us in the north and the northwest of the world to understand the socio-economic meltdown that it has led to in places like Congo. So here in the country which has the highest richness of minerals in the world, people live on $1.50 per day. When that $1.50 is gone because the whole economy gets paralyzed because of the lockdowns and the end too much of international trade and exchanges, people starve. So here, the pandemic causes mass starvation. 27 million people, imagine 27 million people are now food insecure. That's a euphemism for they don't know if they have food next week at the moment. Many millions are now in acute hunger. And we are underfunded and overstretched as humanitarian organizations in this, the most neglected humanitarian emergency in the world.
This volcano also adding to thousands of refugees trying to go over into the over the border into Rwanda. What does that mean?
Well, yes, I mean, Rwanda is actually behind me. You can see Rwandan mountains in the back here. So Rwanda, which is relatively well organized and do not have an active volcano at the moment, is where thousands and thousands try to flee from Goma when there are eruptions and these tremendous earthquakes. Rwanda is a very small place, though. The majority of people in Congo flee within their own country. 5.5 million people have fled conflict in this country. 5.5 million, there's more people fleeing in Congo than there are inhabitants of my country, Norway. And each year we accumulate more people fleeing. There is little funding for us here. We are really, really overstretched, and we do not get the message out that there is a tremendous emergency in the Congo. Precisely for that reason, people are not fleeing across the borders. They are fleeing within their own country, and their misery is also hidden within their own country.
I know you have so much to do there, but I also want to ask you about Yemen. Speaking about children, speaking about people devastated by war, also by climate change. You were in Yemen earlier this year, where in addition to the devastation of the U.S.-backed Saudi-UAE war on the people of Yemen, you observed the catastrophic effects of the climate crisis. Can you talk about what you found there?
Yemen is also one of those countries where sort of all of the plagues of the Bible come at the same time, similar to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I am now. In Yemen, however, the climate change on top of a senseless war, blockade, and poverty beyond belief means that there are places in Yemen that become unlivable. There is no water. There will be zero water in the future. And I think it's important to also understand for us in the high north, Norwegians and Americans and others, who did so much to cause climate change, that we are least and last hit. Though it's the Yemenis, it's the Africans in the Sahel belt who are first and hardest hit. There needs to be investment in making them robust to meet this climate change that is coming in the poorest places on Earth.
Finally, on Egeland, as you travel from one place to another in the world, though you are based in Norway, what gives you hope at this point? When you're seeing the level of refugees in the world, the walls that are being built, the devastation of people as the children in Gaza?
Well, I'm glad you're asking that, because, I've been now a humanitarian worker all my life, for 40 years, really. Started up as a volunteer in the Catholic Relief Organization in Colombia in 1976, 77. What gives me hope and energy to continue is that I see we are reaching people. We're saving lives all the time. Norwegian Refugee Council alone reached more than 11 million displaced people and refugees last year, with education and livelihoods and food and shelter and water and sanitation and free legal aid. We can do so much with small resources. So that's why we urge, richer nations and people to help us reach those who are suffering alone, because we've seen how much we can do. For example, here in the Congo, with small resources, we are bringing hope, education, livelihoods, and a chance for people to get out of dependence. There's a rich soil here. Many of the people we have helped that had to flee from violence are now self-sufficient because they are toiling the soil somewhere else.
And finally, let me ask you something, because what you said made me think about this. Do you see the pandemic as a microcosm, or in fact it's macro, but what we're seeing now, on the one hand, the U.S. was the hardest hit. On the other hand, you've got the wealthiest countries in the world having enough vaccines to inoculate their population over and over again. And you have the poorest countries in the world may not see a vaccine for years. Can you talk about the significance of this vaccine apartheid as it's becoming known?
Yeah, I mean, it's devastating insecurity. This, listen, we are insecurity for the whole world. It's obvious that we're not safe for anyone until every place is safe. If Congo doesn't get vaccines and we get the Congolese to be vaccinated, it will live on here like Ebola would, and it can, since it's so contagious, it will come back in new forms and variations to ourselves. So the self-interest of the richer countries to help all of the world to be inoculated is so obvious. So when there are many, many nations that is not even having 1% of its population vaccinated, that should give some pause to reflection for those who are now close to having vaccinated all of their citizens.
Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, former UN official, speaking to us earlier this week from Goma in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When we come back, we look at the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, one of the deadliest acts of racist terror in U.S. history. Mother Africa by jazz saxophonist Hal Singer and Jeff Gilson. Singer was one of the last remaining survivors of the Tulsa race massacre. He died in August at the age of 100. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This Monday, Memorial Day, marks the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, one of the single greatest acts of racist terror in U.S. history. In 1921, the thriving African-American neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was known as Black Wall Street for its concentration of successful black-owned businesses before it was burned to the ground by a white mob. The violence grew from confrontation at the Tulsa courthouse, where whites had gathered to abduct and lynch a jailed black man who'd been wrongfully accused of assaulting a white woman. Black residents of Greenwood arrived to stop the lynching. Gunshots erupted, after which the white mob set upon Greenwood for 18 hours of mass murder, arson, and looting that would become known as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. An estimated 300 African Americans were killed, over 1,000 injured. 10,000 were left homeless as the racist mob, some of them deputized and armed by Tulsa law enforcement, along with members of the Ku Klux Klan, terrorize the black population. Airplanes were used to drop dynamite and crude incendiary bombs on Greenwood, ultimately burning over 35 city blocks. Over 1,200 homes were destroyed, along with countless businesses. The actual number of dead will never be known, as bodies were tossed into mass graves or thrown in the river. Last week, a House Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing to address the ongoing impacts of the Tulsa massacre. 3 African-American survivors testified in favor of reparations. Viola Fletcher, her younger brother, Hughes Van Ellis, who's 100 years old, and 105-year-old Leslie Benningfield Randall. This is part of their testimony, beginning with Viola Fletcher.
I'm a survivor of the Tulsa race massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not. And other survivors do not. And our descendants do not.
We live with it every day. And the thought of what Greenwood was and what it could have been. We aren't just black and white pictures on a screen. We are flesh and blood. I was there when it happened. I'm still here.
That's right. It seems like justice in America is always so slow or not possible for black people.
3 African-American survivors of the Tulsa race massacre making history as they testified before Congress just ahead of the centennial of the race massacre this Monday. The Department of Homeland Security has said events commemorating the massacre could be a target for white supremacists. President Joe Biden still plans to travel to Tulsa on Tuesday. This Sunday, a documentary by award-winning filmmaker Stanley Nelson premieres on the History Channel. This is the trailer for Tulsa Burning, the 1921 race massacre.
The destruction was so complete. The suffering was so biblical. The betrayal was so profound.
Black communities deserve the opportunity to confront the past.
Our city has been stuck since then. We've never recovered.
Tulsa was the best place in the nation for African Americans.
We have everything from hotels, theaters,
doctors, lawyers.
People refer to it as Black Wall Street.
Showing black people that a new world was possible.
The Tribune published a story titled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." It was a false narrative to keep black people in their place, to reinforce white supremacy.
All across Tulsa, angry whites are now organizing.
They get their guns, they get their torches.
At that point, they start moving towards Greenwood.
All hell broke loose.
My mother says the white folks are killing the colored folks.
Firing into homes.
Bombs dropping from the air.
It was just an all-out massacre.
Not one of those men who participated in the race massacre were ever brought to justice.
The Tulsa Tribune refused to write anything about the massacre for more than 50 years. Victims were being buried in unmarked graves across the city. The reason we understand the history of the massacre is that certain survivors decided to talk about it.
My My mother saw 4 men coming toward our house, and all of them had torches.
We would be looking for the remains of those who were lost so tragically.
This is so beautiful and sad at the same time.
We need to do something about what happened in Tulsa.
There cannot be any justice till there is proper respect, restitution, and repair.
The trailer for Tulsa Burning, the 1921 race massacre. The executive producer of the film, NBA star Russell Westbrook, who played for the Oklahoma City Thunder for over a decade. We're joined now by one of the documentary's directors, Stanley Nelson. His previous films include Freedom Summer, Freedom Riders, The Murder of Emmett Till. Stanley, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's an honor to have you with us again. Lay this out. I mean, this is a story that, as we can see throughout this film, and of course from our own education, was so suppressed for so many decades. Go back in time. Talk to us about Black Wall Street and why so many African Americans came to Oklahoma.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about the story is that African Americans in the decades after the Civil War migrated west. You know, we think of that famous saying, "Go west, young man." Well, African Americans went west. You know, we think about Americans in covered wagons. We don't usually think about African Americans, but African Americans went west in covered wagons, on horseback, on foot, to try to start a new life and try to start a life that they could live with dignity and peace. And they did that. And they did that in Greenwood. And Greenwood was one of over 100 African-American communities in the West, some small, some a little larger. But Greenwood was the biggest and the baddest of those communities. It was a very, very successful community that had businesses, you know, a skating rink, movie theaters, grocery stores, lawyers, doctors, everything. It was really a self-contained community. And that may have been one of the problems with their white neighbors.
Yeah, I was so struck by the history where you talked about African Americans coming north from the oppression of the Deep South. And actually a number of them, they called it Indian country, going to Oklahoma, a number concerned about Oklahoma becoming a state, that it would reinforce the racist laws of the rest of the United States.
Yeah, one of the things that's so fascinating is that, you know, Oklahoma was a territory, and so it was kind of free. You know, it was the home of the land rush, and Black people took part in that. And there was a move to make Oklahoma kind of a Black state for African Americans. But once Oklahoma became a state, then the racist Jim Crow laws took effect, and Black people that had kind of been free in Oklahoma were then persecuted.
This is another clip from your documentary, Tulsa Burning, that features several historians and descendants describing Greenwood's history as the Black Wall Street.
Greenwood was a community of necessity. It was a segregated enclave. Black folks couldn't apply their trades or purchase goods and services in the larger white community, so they created their own economy. That economy became successful because Black folks did business with one another and kept dollars largely in the Black community.
What happens in Greenwood is that segregation, which is not necessarily desired, segregation actually enables Black businesses to thrive, Black professionals to thrive.
It was a district where, in fact, money, dollars, could turn over 5 or 6 times.
In Greenwood, you could, as a Black person, you could advance. And you had a number of individuals in the community that were prospering.
My uncle, he was a physician. His name was Andrew Jackson. Lived up on Detroit Street in the 500 block, sort of a hill right up that street. Detroit in those days had the nicest houses. The Negroes did. The principal of the school lived up there. We had dentists up there. We had wonderful doctors. And my uncle, I told you his name was Dr. Jackson.
My great-grandfather's name was J.B. Stratford. He grew up in Kentucky. His parents were slaves. He was able to get a law degree, go to Oberlin College, and really start his entrepreneurial career in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Stratford Hotel was one of the largest black-owned hotels in the United States. It was a beautiful building, and leaders from throughout the country, when they came through the Midwest, would often stay at the Stratford Hotel.
You have black entertainers that are playing there. Jazz being a really important scene. We think about jazz in Kansas, in Kansas City. It's also important in Greenwood.
Because of the success of Greenwood, Booker T. Washington coined the phrase Greenwood as the Black Wall Street, or the Negro Wall Street of America.
A clip from Tulsa Burning that's going to air on History Channel on Sunday. Stanley Nelson, talk about why you chose to take on this subject to add to your remarkable opus of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more reasons than one. One, it's an incredible American story that needs to be known. You know, the building of Black Wall Street, the building of Greenwood, and also the devastation and destruction. But also, it was really challenging because we're telling two stories at once. So we're also telling the story of 2020, 2021, as Greenwood searches for the remains of African Americans who were buried in mass graves unmarked. And we didn't know what we would find or what they would find. And so we're telling the story of 1921 of Greenwood, and also 2021 in Greenwood.
And, of course, 2020, because when Trump went on the 99th anniversary of Tulsa, so much was raised. I want to go to another clip from your documentary, Tulsa Burning, of Reverend Robert Turner of the Vernon AME Church on Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, the only surviving structure from before the massacre.
When I came to Pastor Vernon Church in Tulsa, I knew nothing about the history of this church. One of my trustees gave me a tour, and when I saw the cornerstone outside, and the cornerstone is still there, it reads, "Basement erected 1919. I said, "Is that the same one we have?" He said, "Yes, that's the same basement that you just walked through." So it survived 1921 race massacre. He was like, "Yes." I was like, "Do you know what this is?" He was like, "Well," I said, we have something left, right? All is not lost.
And nearly 100 years after the Tulsa Race Massacre, a team of scholars is working to uncover the unmarked graves that Stanley Nelson just referred to, of victims with hopes of identifying some of their bodies. In this clip of Tulsa Burning, we hear from Brenda Nails Alford, a descendant of James and Henry Nails, who owned businesses in Black Wall Street.
I always knew that my grandmother had to hide in a church for some reason, but I never knew what that meant. Family members would come to town. My great uncles would come to town, and maybe we'd be driving around, and we would pass Egeland Cemetery. Someone in the car would always say, "You know they're still over there, the victims of the race massacre." And everybody in the car would agree. And I always had a little thing about that cemetery growing up as a kid, because I was like, what's over there? And I would find out so many, many years later that the family member and community members were there.
But in 1921, the people who were killed, people who lost lives, loved ones, they never had the benefit of having a funeral. That touches me at the core, and it should any conscious human being. The fact that we just dump bodies of human beings, of patriots, of veterans, of teachers, of husbands, of wives, children, in mass graves. Nobody ever had a chance to say goodbye.
That last voice, Reverend Robert Turner of Tulsa's Vernon AME Church. Stanley Nelson, what most surprised you as you did this research?
I think one of the things that was so surprising is that there's film footage of the building of Tulsa. The people were so prosperous and so proud of what they were building that in 1920, early in 1921, they made movies and took pictures of their homes and their businesses, and that's really rare. And there's also still pictures and movies of the destruction, so that we see it. And so, as a filmmaker, it was a gift, because it's really a window into what happened. And that really surprised me, because you don't often find film footage of just African American communities, being themselves from the early 20s.
This is another clip from Tulsa Burning. It features Brenda Nails-Alford, a descendant of James and Henry Nails.
Of victimization, it's also a story of resistance. It's also a story of courage and resilience, and that can't be forgotten.
My grandfather, he was a very proud, college-educated shoemaker who did everything he was, quote-unquote, supposed to do. He got his education. He worked hard. He started the businesses. And still, that wasn't enough. And so in this day and time, my question is, when is it enough? When are we enough as a people? They did everything that they could do. They wanted to be successful. These were proud, upstanding members of our community who simply wanted a piece of the American dream and truly received a nightmare.
At the end of this experience, no white person was convicted of an offense related to killing people or destroying the property in the Greenwood district. None. And that is not surprising. I mean, really, when you think about the context, it's not surprising at all.
That last voice, historian Hannibal Johnson. And finally, this clip from Tulsa Burning about the aftermath of the deadly attack.
They're being led away at gunpoint to these so-called internment centers around town, the fairgrounds, the municipal auditorium, the baseball park.
To get out of these centers, people generally had to have a green identification card countersigned by a white person that was willing to vouch for them.
So here you are. You've been illegally arrested by white civilians. You have no idea what's happened to your loved ones if you've been separated from them. If that was your uncle, your brother, your son, your father, you're going to never know what happened to them.
We have to acknowledge that the destruction to the community was intentional, it was conscious, it was systematic.
When the dust settled, somewhere between 100 and 300 people were killed. At least 1,250 homes in the black community were destroyed.
35 square blocks, 36 square blocks, 40 square blocks, just obliterated it.
You could see the iron, metal bed stands where there used to be homes.
$2 million in black wealth went up in flames, right? That was never recouped.
And for people who didn't know what happened to their loved ones, identified as well as unidentified African American massacre victims were being buried in unmarked graves across the city.
Yet another clip from Tulsa Burning. Stanley Nelson, as we wrap up, the issue of reparations 100 years later.
Yeah, I think one of the things the film does and does so well is it makes you think about reparations. It's such a fraught word, but I think that you understand what people mean and why people ask for reparations once you see the film and know the story of Tulsa, which is a real representation of the problems that Black communities suffered through.
And you certainly help us do this in this remarkable documentary. Stanley Nelson, the award-winning director of the new documentary Tulsa Burning, the 1921 Race Massacre, premieres Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern on the History Channel. And that does it for our show. Our condolences to our dear colleague Miriam Barnard. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe.